Hey, what's up, guys? Joker here. Just wanted to run through a video going through the recent Activision Blizzard Microsoft deal, diving on the Sony side. I talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to get it from a what should Sony do? I'm a PlayStation guy, but I don't give a, really that much about the console wars and stuff like that. I have a PS5, a PC, and a Switch, so I'm basically good. But I wanted to talk about it, going from the business side and stuff like that. Deal was $69 billion just about. Sony doesn't have that type of cash. They do have cash on hand. Delving in, making it zero, then generally is not a smart business move. So I can talk about, something they have to do because I do think they do need to buy a publisher. Buying these smaller studios that, let's be honest, under 20 billion, I mean 20 million maybe is what they were spending for Housemark and Bluepoint. I don't really think is going to cut it. I mean, buying an Insomniac type thing, that was up 229 million. There's really not any of those out there on the market that is appealing. Some people might say FromSoft. Well, I'll get into that later. But yeah, generally talking about this, Sony doesn't have that much cash on hand compared to Microsoft. Microsoft just put out their quarter earnings, stuff like that. They had 51 billion in revenue. That wasn't net income, but it's 51 billion in revenue. That's more than Sony does. That's like more than what they do in a year. Um, in, in terms of just revenue, um, maybe like 3 quarters. That's what Sony does, but um, yeah, it's just they can't compete on a big time level, and Sony is gonna have to work through antitrust and stuff like that. And I think honestly, this Microsoft deal with Activision will pass antitrust. They only have the deal America. I think the DOJ will challenge it. That's why they were talking about 18 months. That's what it's going to take that long to get this through. Incorporate Activision might even take longer than that. Make to fully incorporate them into the company might take even longer. But it's beside the point. I mean, when you look at this act, I mean, Microsoft has only gone after, and I'm talking about big ticket items. I know they bought Playground, which is in the UK, but Bethesda and now Activision Blizzard, both are American companies. There's really low scrutiny with trying to deal with that, especially for Microsoft. They've been skating by regulators for a long time. They just buy a lot of crap all the time. Um, but you look at it, Bethesda, it was a private company, so it's also a little different, a little easier to buy, especially since it was such a smaller entity too, compared to Activision. But you look at it, they didn't buy Ubisoft. Ubisoft, they would probably had to deal with Canada and the EU, definitely with France, because they have heavy operations in Canada and in France. They didn't deal with Japan. A lot of people talk about this rule where like Japanese government does not like to sell to America. Um, you know, anything can go for the right price. So I doubt it, but yeah, they didn't have to deal with Japan. They didn't have to deal with China. Like, for example, Nvidia, when they were trying to buy ARM, they had to deal with the US, UK, and China. Nobody thought that deal was going to go through, and it isn't. It looks like it's not going to go through. Um, so that's how Microsoft's been kind of minimizing the antitrust angle. They've been just specifically dealing with American companies. You can look at, well, now what are their options? K2 and EA. Um, they could theoretically buy them. They have the cash to buy both of them. Actually, both of them. But I think, especially with EA, antitrust would probably step in and say, no, you can't buy that. Um, but who knows? Honestly, the landscape might change if Activision Blizzard that deal goes through. It could send a signal to especially bigger companies that are on the sidelines like Facebook and Apple to go up and buy EA and Take Two because those are prime takeover targets if this deal especially goes through. So I want to talk about Sony though, and Sony, this is uh, this is what Reddit has, but I've also seen it on the 10K. It just presents it better. So they didn't lose $25 billion between 3 months. They changed their accounting standards from GAAP to IFRS, and this guy actually explains this. So thankfully, I don't have to really go into too much accounting knowledge, but it mostly is. there's just a different standard in GAAP where what you can recognize as cash, and in IFRS they don't recognize it as cash, so they had to just take that out. So that's why their cash on hand decreased so significantly. But basically, marketable securities, that's something you can very easily liquidate into cash. So they kind of do have some options if they want to. Um, Honestly, surprisingly, just a tidbit, I'm actually surprised they didn't do IFRS. They're a Japanese company. GAAP is specifically American. It's like America only does this. IFRS, basically every other country does it. So, I mean, they are listed in a US exchange, but it's just an ADR, which means they don't really have to do GAAP because they're a foreign company. But yeah, so they have, let's just say they have 44 billion just because they ostensibly do have 44 billion dollars. Um, so I mean, these are the ones people have been talking about: Capcom, FromSoft, and Square Enix. You look at this, I have Capcom pulled up 5 billion market cap. Square Enix is about 6, and FromSoft is more complicated. I think a lot of people don't know about this, but they're owned by a huge Japanese media company called Katakawa. Katakawa is actually valued at about the same as Sony. So I don't think they would sell their gaming, brands. That could be an option because they are more in published media like manga, papers, and stuff like that. They do more like they're kind of like a New York Times, but with like new media stuff because of a merger they had. But they're like New York Times if they had anime. So FromSoft, I don't think is really going to happen. It could happen. I mean, it's just one piece they could just slice off and sell. I could see From Software being in that Insomniac build, which would be like around 300 million to 500 million, something like that. Um, but again, that's just one studio, and I think that's a lot of money to spend on one studio that makes one game at a time. Meanwhile, you have Insomniac, which is making like 3 games at a time. So that's just the value in that. What meanwhile you could spend, and you wouldn't be spending 4.85 billion. You'd be spending eight. I mean, not eight, maybe like 6 to 7 billion, and this is dollars. In Square Enix case, maybe 8 billion to buy these companies. So like that fits under the 19 billion they have. Maybe 45 million. Um, you know, that's about like what that's 14 billion right there. You spend, you get Capcom and Square Enix. That's a pretty sweet deal. Um, I found this article interesting mostly because this article was a few days after that the Microsoft Activision deal was announced. This was before, so Blue Point, Housemarque. I mean, these were obvious options. Warner Entertainment. Um, Warner was being shopped by AT&T for $4 billion. The problem is they don't own a lot of the IPs that make them valuable. You would have to have a licensing deal with Warner Brothers Discovery, which is going to be the new company that will own all those Warner assets. Um, I don't know what you would have to do, but the thing is, not owning those IP is a huge bummer, and probably why nobody bought WB games. Like EA, I mean, there were a lot of people who were expressing interest. It was EA, Activision, Take Two, Microsoft, Sony. So everyone who's big, they wanted to buy it, but because they couldn't get the licensing probably sorted out, I think that's when nobody bought it. Quantum Dream, there's no chance. NetEase invested in them. I feel like Sony's just like done with them. It's a shame, but I don't see it happening. Platinum Games, they're kind of getting exclusives like from Nintendo and PlayStation, so I don't feel like it's Square Enix. I don't feel like they're really in trouble, so to say. And also, their quality is very erratic, unlike FromSoft. So it'd be again, this would be another studio. It would be smaller range. It'd probably be like 100 to 200 million to buy Platinum, maybe even less. Who knows? But yeah, and Remedy, very interesting company. They're public, so their market cap is a little smaller. I think it's like less than a billion, something like that. Um, but they're a public company, so that means they can be taken over pretty easily, and their value is also more apparent. They have a lot of contracts and a lot of deals out already. this is another studio which is like it makes kind of no sense for them, uh, for Remedy to sell. So yeah, Kojima. This is another one where it's like I feel like this guy can get any deal he wants, and there's like a billion rumors on what his next game is gonna be. So I don't think Sony could buy him because it'd be up to Kojima to sell. I think he just is done personally with being under a big corporate entity because he got enough of that with Konami for like 20 years plus. FromSoft, I already talked about. Supermassive. I feel really bad that they didn't buy Supermassive because I think it was bad for both parties. I mean, yes, Supermassive had those two very bad VR games, Impatient and Bravo Team, but I think they're still a talented studio, especially with the last one of those anthology games you showed. Hey, maybe they can still make these good games, horror games. This would be a pretty cheap deal, mostly because I think really Bandai Namco is like, yeah, that publishing deal. I think we want to pull that. So if they are a free agent, I could see Sony kind of just scooping them up for the cheap, and kind of just saying, hey, let's just take a flyer. So I think they could buy it, but again, this isn't that mega deal that people are looking for. But yeah, I could totally see Supermassive being bought. Level 5 is very interesting and it's also very sad. Level 5 is really actually hitting like hard times, like financially. They have good relationships, but like they're really struggling and they're a pretty big studio. Um, I could see Sony buying them because there is talent there, there's bodies there, and I think that's also a very valuable thing when it comes to these studios is, just having a studio rather than building it up and taking a lot of time, kind of like what Microsoft is doing with the initiative. You already have like 200, 300 people there at level 5. You can make games. They just need to be put on the right direction. They just need funding. I think is an important thing also for level 5. And I could see them maybe just go back, reboot Nino Kuni, like, come back to that world and, just try to reimagine it because I feel like the Nino Kuni series is something that is very, very valuable. From them, Dark Cloud, that is something Sony definitely owns. The thing is with Nino Kuni, I don't know who owns that. It could be level 5, it could be Sony, or it could be Bandai Namco. And Bandai Namco is another weird company. They own a bunch of anime rights and stuff like that. I don't actually know what their value at, but this website is actually handy and it's actually very accurate. So it's not, yeah, 15 billion. And like that's the entirety of Bandai Namco. What I was talking about, they own more than just like video game assets. They own like other media properties and stuff like that. So that's why they're worth so much more. And that could cost like 18 billion, 19 billion dollars to buy. I find this post a little interesting. Uh, I find this post a little interesting. It was like the 4 companies they could use to beat Sony. So it was talking about, Ubisoft, Take-Two, Capcom, and Square Enix. I feel like it's gonna. If you want my opinion, I think Capcom and Square Enix are gonna be the easiest. It's kind of like the same thing Microsoft is doing, buying in the home country. Buying in Japan, I think will be really easy for Sony to do. They're very cheap. They could combine cost 14 to 16 billion, something like that. That could work. You get a bunch of IP that people really love and really care about, and you get manpower, like I was talking about earlier. And I think buying those two will also allow you to buy smaller moves, kind of like, like a level 5 platinum, something like that, or even smaller studios that you can, like Supermassive, that can just flesh out your team a bit to try to get up to what Microsoft is at, which is like over 50 studios at this point. Um, Ubisoft, though, is interesting. I think Ubisoft is in a bad spot financially. Their games are always half off, literally a month after they're out. And I think they also fill a good void. I mean, not a good void, a void that Sony has, which is these multiplayer games, these more actiony games, and they have big properties like Far Cry, Rainbows. I mean, just Tom Clancy in general, Watch Dogs, and then Assassin's Creed. I mean, they have plenty of IP there This will cost around, like I was saying, like 10 billion to buy. I think if you buy Square Enix, Capcom, and Ubisoft, then at that point it's around 25, 26 billion. I think they do have that much liquidity to go out there and get that. You really look at that and really digest it, and you can say Microsoft spent 75 billion on Bethesda and Activision, and Sony comes out and spends less than 30 billion and buys Ubisoft, Square Enix, and Capcom. I think a lot of people are going to say that Sony easily won that because they got more quality, they got more IP, and they got a lot of manpower. Ubisoft has a shit ton of studios all across the world. You can easily outsource games, like remasters and stuff like that for a bunch of your beloved IP that's in your backlog, because now you have the manpower to do it. You don't have to build it up after, and take years to build up the manpower that a company like Ubisoft has. And you can help Square Enix, you can, take them under better direction and better guidance. Because honestly, I think that's what Square Enix needs. I think they just need to let the creatives do what they need to do, and kind of slap them back onto the rail if they try to spin off and go out of control and make like Chocobo Grand Prix or something like that. Um, and then Capcom, I think Capcom's in a fine direction. I think they just need to stop with these remakes and stuff like that. They're relying too much on nostalgia to try to carry them, which is fine because that's actually what put them on the right track. With Resident Evil 2 remake, Resident Evil 7. I feel like going back into their catalog. Dino Crisis is a game people talk about. Maybe making Monster Hunter more accessible and more grandiose. That could be that multiplayer type of thing that gets people in there. But yeah, I think honestly, my recommendation would be Ubisoft, um, Capcom, and Square Enix. I don't think realistically they can afford to buy Take Two, because Take Two would probably look for a premium of like 50%, kind of like where Activision kind of got, but not really, because they basically are at a $95 a share is basically where they were a few months ago. I mean, like 8 months ago. So it's not really a big deal. And really, what knocked them off was those allegations. Without those, they probably would have gone higher. So they kind of aren't even like whole. But yeah, I mean, Take Two. I mean, especially after buying Zynga, it's like, do you really want to even mix with that? Um, but yeah, I think I'm gonna just call it there. Very interesting topic. Very interesting topic. Um, gonna be interesting to see what Sony does, but who knows? They have the money. They can make the decision. Yeah. What did you guys think? What studio do you think is going to be most likely to be bought? Let me know in the comments. And yeah, please leave a like and subscribe. Really helps out the channel. Until next time, see you later.